Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving recently. Welcome to AIA Denver's first lecture of the season. Sorry we had a bit of a late start. As many of you know, the AIA, the Archaeological Institute of America, was chartered by Congress and represents archaeology in America and across the world. If you're interested in becoming a member, I invite you to check out archaeological.org. Your membership funds all sorts of important preservation of sites, that sort of thing, excavations, promotes learning of archaeology, et cetera, et cetera. Our little society is one of the oldest in the country. It's the oldest or one of the oldest west of the Mississippi. So if you're a Colorado resident, your choices are Boulder or Denver. And I invite you guys to join. Part of the AIA's recent work that has been pretty relevant has involved trying to preserve museum collections in Afghanistan. This is something I've been involved with along with Brian Daniels at the national level. As some of you know, I worked in Afghanistan for quite a while, and there are quite a few archaeologists still stuck there, Afghan archaeologists who are trying to leave. We're trying to help them as well and get them placed into, museum jobs, university jobs, etc. Sort of related, Aurora has been resettling a lot of Afghans lately. So if there are any Afghans in your community, please try and make them feel welcome. Without further ado, today's lecture is by Richard Bussmann. Richard Bussmann studied Egyptology, Assyriology, and Theology at the University of Heidelberg, the Free University of Berlin, Humboldt University Berlin, and Göttingen University. Apologies for my pronunciation.
That's the Chipotle.
He received his PhD. Can I ask everyone to mute themselves?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I've been muting people, but sorry.
He received his PhD in Egyptology from the Free University of Berlin in 2007. His PhD thesis focused on the archaeology and history of local community shrines in the times of the pyramids. In 2010, he held a postdoctoral research fellowship of the Humboldt Foundation at Cambridge University. In the same year, he was appointed lecturer, and in 2014, senior lecturer in Egyptology and Egyptian archaeology at the University College London. In 2016, he took up his current position as professor of Egyptology at the University of Cologne. Dr. Bussmann combines archaeology and philology in his research. He is interested in the society and culture of provincial archaeology in the Old and Middle Hittite, I don't know where I got Hittite from, Old and Middle Kingdoms, 2700 to 1700 BC. Using theories from social anthropology, archaeology, and cultural history, he directs a project on the early inscriptions of ancient Egypt and is co-director of an archaeological fieldwork project at Zawiat Sultan in Middle Egypt. Dr. Bussmann is currently finalizing a book for Cambridge University Press, provisionally titled Egypt in the Shadow of the Pyramids, Archaeology of Society and Culture, 2700 to 1700 BC. And on that note, I'd also like to welcome any of our friends from our sister organization in Denver, the Egyptian Studies Society. Dr. Bussmann, whenever you're ready, please feel free to take over.
Thank you, Eric, for this kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak to Denver. It's a great pleasure for me to present parts of my research to the Egyptological crowd on the other side of the Atlantic. My talk is, I'm trying to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. So my talk is entitled Colonizing Provincial Egypt, Pyramids and the Early State. And the title brings together a variety of things that I'd like to talk about today. And Eric mentioned already my previous research in provincial Egypt. And let me briefly explain why I think that this is a fascinating field of research. Egypt is one of those important early civilizations in human history. There are many firsts in Egypt together with Mesopotamia, such as the invention of writing around 3000 BC, a little bit earlier. The first towns and cities started to populate the globe in the Fertile Crescent, that includes Egypt. We see centralized polities arising both in the Iraq and modern Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. And another feature certainly is also monumentality. So I think most of us, when we think of Egypt, we think of the monuments of Egypt, the big temples, and of course the pyramids. And all of this is absolutely entirely crucial to position Egypt in world history. But if you look closely, most of the arguments are based on contexts of the elites. It means the kings and the high officials. This is where you find inscriptions. This is where you find monumental self-presentation, where you find administration and so forth. And the question of my research generally, and this is also true for this talk, is what does early civilization, what does complexity mean at a local level? What does it mean if you live 500 kilometers away from the center? What does it mean to be suddenly part of a civilization? And both in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, we see different types of early states arising, so centralized polities. And my question for this talk is how the centralized state colonized the provincial hinterland. So it's very simple to say that I'm the king of Egypt, but actually if nobody believes you, it is not efficient. So in one way or the other, you have to set up power, you have to manipulate social relationships in order for others to share your vision. And this is the background of my talk. So colonizing provincial Egypt is about how the early state tried to connect to local communities, how it tried to establish power in the hinterland. And what you see here on the slide is the site that I'm currently excavating. This is located in Middle Egypt, approximately 400 kilometers to the south of Cairo. Some of the more monumental remains is this mud brick wall in the background. So this is of the later pharaonic period. You can see here a desert escarpment with some rock tombs, and I will show one of them later today. But the key piece, the flagship of the site, really is what you see here in the center, and this is the remains of a pyramid. And this pyramid, if you want, is the hook for my talk. So I'm interested in contextualizing this pyramid. What's the story of this pyramid? Of course, when I say pyramids of Egypt, it is very difficult to avoid this slide. These are the very famous pyramids of Giza. If you want, these are the big sisters of the small pyramid that I've just shown you. The pyramids of Giza are still really monumental and fascinating pieces of architecture. Research on the building technology of the pyramids is still ongoing. And I would assume that even for modern architects, it would not be simple to construct a pyramid so that they don't collapse. And so forth, and to quarry the very hard stone varieties that have been used here. You can see here on the slide the three famous pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaura, plus three smaller pyramids of queens. And these pyramids they are so well known because they are well preserved, and also because these are the most gigantic pyramids. We should be aware that many of the later pyramids are more of the size of the Queen's pyramids. These are still quite monumental structures, but they are not the kinds of giants that you see. It's a very short period in Egyptian history where you have these very gigantic pyramids, and this is in the early Old Kingdom. I'm going to show a slide with chronology later on. So yes, they are interesting pieces of architecture. Of course, we can also interpret the pyramids as symbols of certain ideas. For instance, symbols of power, which they certainly are. Others have argued that the pyramids served as stairways to heaven. So the deceased king who was buried within the pyramid would step the pyramids up in order to reach the sky. This is an idea that builds on later religious text where the idea of the king ascending to sky is being expressed. And these are absolutely fascinating questions. It's just that the angle that I'm taking on these pyramids is a slightly different one. I am more interested in what pyramids tell us about society. So yeah, what does the pyramid, what do these pyramids reveal about social organization in Egypt? You can make a quick comparison to America today, if I may, and it is similar asking at the Pentagon, the Empire State buildings tell us about American society. In certain ways, they tell us very much, and in other ways, you hardly learn anything for means to farmer 2,000 kilometers Washington. So this is the kind of question that I'm asking, which means that if you want to understand how the pyramids are embedded socially, you have the pyramids rather in the hinterland. This is what I want to do today. I will not focus very much on theory in this talk, but I get these to mention sources of inspiration for my research. On the left-hand side, you can see the book of a great scholar called Norman Yoffe. He's an Eastern archaeologist, Myth of the Archaic State, Evolution of the Earliest City-States and Civilization, 2005. Norman Yoffe is not so much interested in classifying societies. This is what you see in very much in art. So discussions of whether you should call something a chiefdom or a state or an empire, but he says it is not so interesting to classify societies and polities. What we should do as archaeologists is to look at diachronic change, meaning change through time. How have societies changed from being governed as a chiefdom towards a state or towards an empire? So by change, we understand the social disposition of people. So this is something I'd like to take up, change. Just looking at this, it's not a static picture that I want to draw for ancient Egypt, but a second is political anthropologists not seeing like a state, how certain schemes to improve the human condition is also rather famous. And he was interested in how how states try to make societies legible. So his key hypothesis is that civilized nations don't understand the country that they govern, and they impose top-down certain measurements of which they believe that they would help. These top-down initiatives don't work in local communities, function differently. Trying to do this with more recent examples, and I'm interested in applying his idea to ancient Egypt. And on the right side, I see a work by a social anthropologist, Timothy Mitchell, Colonizing Egypt. He was studying, or he is studying modern Egypt, and here particularly, he's interested in studying. So how does the new name Egypt became, and how does this nation affect persons drawn into the ambit of the new nation state? in strategies that the central administration of ancient Egypt at an early stage of state, how they tried to integrate provincial hinterland with central administration. So this is, if you want, the theoretical background of my talk. I will focus my presentation on a few key sites. This is Northern Africa, Arabian Peninsula, and parts of the which comes from Uganda and Ethiopia, and it flows through the Sudan, the modern state of Sudan, and approximately here is the modern Egyptian-Sudanese border. This part here is called Lower Nubia, and this is more or less flooded by the Nasser, by Lake Nasser, which was created when the Aswan High Dam was built. So there's a huge high dam here just south of the modern city of Aswan, and this was opened in the 1970s. In 1970, this is when this high dam was built. Many temples were not replaced, they were relocated, and Abu Simbel, of which many of you will have heard, Abu Simbel is the most famous example. The original location of this temple was flooded, and the entire temple was cut out of the mountain and was mounted again a few meters further up the hill. So this is the Aswan High Dam. And then comes the heartland of Egypt, and I will concentrate on this. This is what we call Upper Egypt. And here is the modern city of Cairo, and we call Lower Egypt. So Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt. Alexandria is another important modern town located at the Mediterranean coast. So in white, you can see the some of the important modern cities of Egypt, and in red, these are the ancient sites that I will talk about: Abu Zir, Giza, and Shur, located just south of Cairo. Said Sultan, this is the site doing fieldwork. Elephantine, Nile, Island, just Aswan, and another which is located, it's a harbor site in Hard, located at the coast of the Red Sea. A quick look at the chronology of Egypt. The largest piece is here in yellow, dynastic Egypt. So this is the history of Egypt that is divided into dynasties. From dynasty 1 to dynasty 30, this is approximately 3,000 years. And this is followed by the Greco-Roman period, followed by the Arab conquest of Egypt. This is the beginning of the Arab-Ottoman period. And then in 1922, Egypt came first a kingdom, and in 1952, an independent republic. Those of you who are more into prehistory may be more familiar with the technology ages. So the Chalcolithic, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age in Egypt. My talk is I will concentrate my talk on the third millennium, that is between 3000 and 2000, or in prehistoric terminology, the early Bronze Age. Just a few terms that we will need for this talk. So the third millennium is divided into the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is the first cycle of centralized rule in Egypt. So this is when the first central state unfolded in the Old Kingdom. The early Old Kingdom, dynasties 3 and 4, this is a period of strong centralization. In dynasty 5, we see a flourishing of the state. And in dynasty 6, Egypt starts disintegrating into regional polities. And this is characteristic of the first intermediate period. This is a period when Egypt was not united under just one king, but several smaller princedoms and polities were stretched along the Egyptian heartland. Doris, just one question. I see that sometimes I get the information that my internet connection is not stable. Could you just tell me whether you can hear me clearly?
No, sometimes it kind of breaks down. It goes in and out.
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I'm sitting just next to the router, so the connection should be stable. Give me just 1 second.
Now it's actually fine.
Now it's better.
Yeah, but sometimes it goes in and out.
Yeah, okay. I'm very sorry if this happens. It might. I think that most of you have already switched off the the screen. So I hope that it's going to be better now. Yeah, so I think the chronological charts are more or less self-explaining. So this is just to introduce some dates and some terms which I will use later in my talk. I would like to start with the first couple of sites, Abusir, Giza, and Dashur. All of these three sites are locations of pyramids and royal cemeteries. So each pyramid of the Old Kingdom was the center of a cemetery that was placed around the pyramid, and in the cemetery were buried the highest officials of the state. And I would like to introduce you first to the pyramids of Dashur. This is how Dashur looks like from the air. So this is a satellite image taken with the Google Earth, very simple. And you can see very nicely that even from the space, you can identify these big pyramids. These large pyramids, these are actually immediate forerunners of the pyramids of Giza. Snefru is the father of Khufu, and the pyramids of Snefru are as gigantic, almost as gigantic as the pyramids of Giza. So these pyramids are also very well known. They are located in the desert, and we are particularly interested. So I should say that Snefru had 2, possibly even 3 pyramids. You can see 2 of them here on the slide. These 2 big pyramids have been built by Snefru, and this is the pyramid that we will be concentrating on. And you can see here a structure that leads from the pyramid to a lower temple. And from there leads another causeway further down. This green area here, these are modern fields. This is what we call the cultivation. And more or less, this map has been drawn here on the on this topographic map. So you can see here the cultivation. And this is the valley that leads up to the lower temple that I've just shown you. And this is the causeway up to the pyramid. This pyramid is called the Bent Pyramid. The Bent Pyramid is a key piece for the questions that I'm discussing, a key piece for discussing the colonization of the provincial hinterland. Why this is so is something I'd like to show you. Here is a view on the Bent Pyramid. It's called Bent Pyramid because of the bend. Here, probably the pyramid, while it was built, it was too steep, so it cracked. But still, the pyramid was finished, but in a softer angle. And the lower temple is what you can see here in the foreground. So this is a stone-lined temple with a mud brick enclosure wall. And what is of interest for us is this lower temple. The pyramid doesn't have a lot of inscriptions. So there's the stela saying, so it's a stone slab saying this is where Snefru is buried, but not much more. Whereas this lower temple is much more talkative. There are inscriptions and there is display. So this is again the the arrangement in the landscape. Here is the pyramid, this is the causeway, this is the lower temple, and the German Archaeological Institute has recently discovered this artificial harbor at the lower end of the causeway. 1 second, please. The lower temple, this is how the lower temple looks like. Recent excavations have revealed that not only was a temple built, but with the temple came magazines and houses for the priests, which were built here. And the temple replaces a slightly earlier temple of the same king. We don't know exactly why the earlier temple was given up. The earlier temple is not very well preserved, but the later temple is. And after a few generations, this is what happens with the lower temple. People started moving into the enclosure of the temple. Probably these are huts and houses of priests that were on service for the king. The king's nephew had a couple of statues erected here in these niches, and these statues received offerings. The offerings had to be delivered, and after the offerings had been made, they were distributed to the priests. So being a priest in a royal mortuary cult was a rather prestigious and economically, a thing that was economically worthwhile. What I'm interested in here for this talk is the decoration of this temple. So you see the supernized relief, raised relief, and it shows, so this is a block that was found in the lower temple. And what you can see here is a series of female offering bearers. These are female individuals. They all carry food and drinks, and all of them carry the sign of life. And when you reconstruct these blocks, this is a whole range of blocks that don't look similar. And this is a procession of female offering bearers, all directed towards the statues of the king. So in the reconstruction of the temples, of the lower temple, you would have to envision these female offering bearers walking with their offerings to the king. It's a symbolic representation for feeding the king. An interesting feature is this structure that the offering bearers wear on their heads. These are actually hieroglyphs, and this structure here, that rectangle, is a representation of a domain. A domain is, well, we haven't excavated a domain yet, but what we believe it is an agricultural unit somewhere in the hinterland. So in fact, these are not women carrying offerings to the king, but these are agricultural units, like individual farmers or farming villages who had to deliver offerings for the deceased king. This is what we call the domains of the Old Kingdom. These domains were the farmsteads that paid taxes to central administration. I think this would be the modern terminology. These are the taxpayers that we see here on the walls. And at the beginning of the wall, you see another symbol, this one over here. This is in fact the standard. And this standard represents what is in Egyptology called a nome. So this, I put the terms here in the label. A nome, that's a Greek word, and it means administrative district. So actually what we see here is that these individual taxpayers, they were all located in certain districts. It means that the central administration, which planned this temple, showed on the walls the economic foundation of the royal mortuary cult. This is as if today, let's say, a deceased American president would have a tomb, and the tomb has decoration, and on the tomb walls you would see the states of the individual states of the United States, and within the states you would have representations of the of taxpayers, basically. So this is how you can imagine what's happening here on the wall. It's very interesting for the question of colonization, for the colonization of the hinterland. The central administration imagined the hinterland as being ordered in districts, nomes, and agricultural units placed within those districts, the domains. If you go to provincial sites, you will not find references to nomes or domains. In local communities, what a nome is and what a domain is seems to be rather poorly understood. These are not units that communities would calculate with. So if you want, this is a little bit of a virtual imagination of the hinterland. The reality of the hinterland was an entirely different one. So to speak with James Scott, the central administration imposed an administration on the hinterland, which in the hinterland wasn't recognized as such. It's quite an interesting phenomenon, I would say. So this is another close-up of another of those blocks. It looks very similar. Again, you can see our female offering bearers, and again, a standard in between. This is a different nome. Then these individual domains had names. So for instance, this domain here had a name called the gaming pieces of King Snefru. Or this domain over here was named the joy of Snefru. So what might have happened is that existing farming villages were renamed, and they were given a royal name, and they had to pay taxes. This might be a reality behind it. The domain economy is a very important one. So in the course of the Old Kingdom, the pieces that I've just shown you, they are from the 4th dynasty, from the early Old Kingdom. In the later parts of the Old Kingdom, the number of domains and nomes increases, and more and more domains appear on the walls of the royal pyramids. So this is from the this is an example of the 5th dynasty from King Sahura, and again you can see here a nome symbol on a male individual, and behind him again domains. And other cities. This is the sign for town or city or perhaps village. We don't know how large these settlements really were, but all of them are taxpayers for the royal funerary cult. And as the domain economy was growing, we also see that in the administration, the actual administration of the country, gradually the nomes and domains became reality. So at the beginning, it was an artificial regime imposed on the hinterland, but later they became more and more real, if you want. This is part of a papyrus found at Abu Sir. This is another pyramid cemetery. And Egyptologists were very lucky that remains of papyri were found here. And you can see here the complexity of the royal funerary cult. It was not only a representational imagination, but there was a real administration behind it. You can see here nomes and domains and other entities whose names are built with the name of the king. This is the cartouche of the king. And you can see, for instance, in this column here is written the name of the bringer. So it was here recorded who delivered the taxes, the food and the grain and the meat and so forth, who delivered it. And here are recorded the quantities of what has been, where's my pointer. Here are the quantities of what has been delivered. And sometimes you can see that there was an expectation of how much should come in and how much was really delivered. And then there was an imbalance and so forth. It's a rather complex business with many different individuals being involved. So I take this papyrus as a sign of the reality of administration, which in earlier periods was invented. Gradually, it became reality. This is the story, I think, of these papyri. And together with the growing relevance of central administration, we see also that the pyramid temples in the architecture became larger and larger. On the left-hand side, you can see again the pyramid of King Snefru, of the bent pyramid, which I've seen shown you at the beginning. And there is a very small chapel here attached to the pyramid. This is where this is the site of the royal funerary cult. And later, in the 6th dynasty, so 300 years later, this temple is almost more monumental than the pyramid itself. It means that it was not so much the royal burial itself which became important, but much more important was the continued deliveries for the deceased king. It means the royal funerary cult became more and more important. This was the engine that integrated the entire country. Yeah, so this is the first point that I would like to make for this question on the colonization of the hinterland. So my argument here is it was the royal funerary cult that drove the colonization, because food had to be delivered and new administrative units had to be invented and turned into reality during the Old Kingdom. This didn't exist from the beginning. It was something that only was invented over time. I'd like to go on to the second side, to Wadi Ajaf. This is the harbor side at the Red Sea. And this side has become, I would say, in the past 10 years, one of the key sites of Old Kingdom research. Why this is so, I'm going to show you. So Wadi Ajaf is located here at the mouth of what we call a wadi. It means a valley, which led from the Nile Valley to the Red Sea. This is part of the Suez Gulf, is part of the Red Sea. And Wadi Ajaf was a harbor site. From here, the Egyptians traveled to the Sinai, to Serabit Echadim and Wadi Marara. These are turquoise quarries. And copper mines were also located here. And from Wadi Ajaf, there were also ships going further south to the land of Punt, which is where the Egyptians obtained incense from. So for a very long time, the site Wadi Ajaf remained undiscovered until 2000, I think was around 2005, between 2005 and 2010, a French team discovered that there were actually remains of the Pharaonic period. It's a beautiful site. You arrive there. I think the first thing you want to do is not to do excavation, but you want to start swimming, I think. But then you start looking more closely on the ground, and you can see in the front of this photo, you can see a few dry stone walls. And when archaeologists investigated the site, they found that this part over here was a place for ships to arrive. And on the ground here, they found a few anchors. So this is one of them. So the ships could be tied to these pieces of stone. I mean, there is no high, there are not very high waves or so. So you don't need very strong anchors. So this was absolutely fine for the purpose. So and the boats arrived here, and then people would jump here on the beach, and a few meters behind them, they would find this desert mountain. and archaeologists discovered these caves in the mountain. Within the caves, there were still remains of some wooden pieces and of ropes, as you can see here. From this side and from other Red Sea ports, we know that the Egyptians did not carry the boats through the Nile Valley and through the Wadi towards the Red Sea, but rather they stored their boats in the caves. So every time they arrived at Wadi al-Jar from the Nile Valley, they would assemble the boats of the wooden planks, and they would then travel onwards. When they come back, they would arrive in Wadi al-Jar, disassemble the boat, put all the wooden planks into the cave, and travel onwards to the Nile Valley. Because nobody lived at this site, there was no agriculture possible or anything. So this was just a harbor site without any settlements. And this is how the boats were stored. This in itself, I think, is an interesting story. So something that I think is not something that you would usually think of unless you find it in the archaeology. But even more exciting was the discovery of papyri. These papyri were found before the entrances, in front of the entrances to the caves. As you can see from this papyri, it was rather well preserved. And the first set of papyri was published a few years ago with really absolutely amazing results. This is the diary of an official. You can see here days counted. These are numbers. So this is day 22, day 23, day 24, and so forth and so forth. So this official recorded what he did with whom, where. And it's interesting to see that this official, who is called Merer, he was obviously responsible for the travel to the Red Sea. But this papyrus does not record the travel to the Red Sea, but it records the hauling and transport of stone blocks for the pyramids. So the place names that are mentioned here, these are pyramids. This, for instance, is the name of Khufu. And I think this is something that archaeologists didn't dare dreaming of, namely to find evidence of the reality of stone hauling and transport of individual blocks from the quarries near the pyramids to the pyramids. So here is a reality of large-scale central administration at work. So it's something that happens not only in the center, but it also happens outside the center, such as here in Wadi al-Jar. So the whole funerary cult, the building of the pyramids, as well as the funerary cult, they required large-scale written bureaucracy. This is what we can see here from the papyri. So really amazing finds that a French team made here. I would now like to move on to Zawit Sultan. We leave central administration a little bit. We leave the pyramids, the grand pyramids of the kings and so forth, and we look into a local community several hundred kilometers away from the center. Zawit Sultan is also called Zawit al-Maitin in the research literature, and it was the capital of one of the nomes, more specifically of the 16th nome of Upper Egypt. So it was not a village or so, it was not a farmstead, it was a capital, a settlement. We're still trying to find the settlement itself. We have the tombs, we have other things, but not yet the settlement. So a rather significant regional center. This is how the situation looks like today. This is the modern city of El Minya in Middle Egypt. The Bride of Upper Egypt, is it called? It's called in among the Egyptians living here today. And Zawit Sultan is something like 10 kilometers to the south of this city. And when we zoom in, this is the archaeological side of Zawit Sultan. All of this is part of the main side. What you can see here, this darker area, these are remains, settlement debris of the Greco-Roman town. And the Greco-Roman town was built over pharaonic monuments such as tombs and also the pyramid. The pyramid which you saw on the entrance slide of my talk is this structure over here. So you can see this from the air. And there are a few other archaeological remains further south here and here. They are poorly investigated. So what we try to do is to understand how the site developed through the millennia, from the late pre-dynastic period through the Old Kingdom up to the early Islamic period. So we have 5,000 years here of local history. I'll show you just a little bit around. First, we look to the north. Then we look behind this desert ridge here, this escarpment, and then to the south, so you get a sense of how the site looks like. To the north is a beautiful Muslim cemetery today. And it's very likely that parts of the ancient settlement are located below this cemetery. Behind the site, so behind the desert escarpment, you have many structures that look like this. These are quarries. The step-like structure results from a certain quarrying technique, which is a little bit complicated to explain, but it's interesting. When you stand up here on the top of the hill, you look into a huge quarry site. The entire area, I would say up to 10 kilometers, looking into the desert. All of this was a huge quarry used presumably from the Pharaonic period up to rather recently. This area, slightly further away, is still a very important region for quarrying limestone. So there is a tradition that reaches back into Pharaonic Egypt. And the stone blocks of the small pyramid from Zawit Sultan were probably quarried in these local quarries. And to the south, there is a very poorly understood late period. It means 500 BC or so. A cemetery, you can see here stone sarcophagi lying open on the ground. All of this would require protection. It would require excavation. You can see here a few mud bricks coming out of the rubble here. So if we really wanted to excavate the entire site, I think this would take, I assume, another several millennia. So it's a huge site, and we have just begun. So it's a rather, I think this, what I want to show here is the potential of the site and the complexity and diversity of the monuments that we find here. So in my talk, I will concentrate on three structures, or three sides. A, the pyramid, which you already know, or remains of the pyramid. This dates to the early Old Kingdom, so it's roughly contemporary to the bent pyramid of King Snefru. We have recently discovered a new cemetery over here in this area, and this is how the cemetery looks like. It's individual shafts, and the shafts were stiffened with mud bricks. This is what you can see today. And another important site, this is also early Old Kingdom, so it's the same period as the pyramid. And slightly later of the late Old Kingdom are these rock tombs with sculpture and inscriptions. These are the three things I want to show of Zawit Sultan. Here is a map created by the topographers. He took measurements. So here you get a sense of the relief, the profile of the site. It's rather steep. It looks gentle, but it's rather steep to walk up from the pyramid here down. This is the side entrance over here. This is the side entrance here. Here is the pyramid, which is located here. Then you walk over tons and tons of pottery sherds, which are indicated here. It's the Greco-Roman settlement debris. And below the settlement debris, here are shaft tombs. And here further up the hill are the rock tombs. They are located over here. This is where the rock tombs are located. Yeah, first the pyramid. This is how it looks like when you approach the site. The site is open to tourism. So if you visit Middle Egypt, you are invited to visit Sultan. The pyramid has several layers. I will show an image from above later. The outer layer is very simple to see. The outer layer is of much better quality limestone than the core of the pyramid. Presumably, these blocks remain from the local quarries that I've shown you, whereas the outer casing probably is made of blocks imported from elsewhere, from a higher quality limestone. What we did is we exposed the corners of the pyramid in order to understand the stratigraphy. What is important to understand is that in the research literature, the pyramid as such was known. It is one of 7 pyramids, all of equal size, scattered through provincial Egypt. So there are other sites in Upper Egypt where you find comparable pyramids, identical in size, identical in construction technique, but almost all of them without inscriptions. It's just because they all have the same size, the same building technique, that we interpret them as a royal building initiative. So we believe that in the early 4th dynasty, maybe King Snefru, or perhaps his predecessor, it's difficult to date the pyramids precisely, that he set up these pyramids across provincial Egypt in order to represent kingship locally. It's another strategy of imposing kingship on provincial communities. And much of the research literature deals with the function of the pyramids for kingship, how the state is represented, how the pyramids relate to the king and so forth, but very little research has been done on the local context of the pyramids. So the question that we have started our excavation with is, how did the pyramid arrive? What was there before the pyramid was built? How did the pyramid change the local settlement? And this is why the stratigraphy, it means the layers, were important in order to understand how the pyramid relates to the topography. And this is what we found out. So we did a bit of training with the Egyptian inspectors, which went very well. This is what is called capacity building. And Eric just mentioned the protection of monuments. And I think it's very important that the protection and also care of the monuments is with the local inspectors. So I think it's very important to, to train inspectors, but also to understand what they have to tell about the pyramids. That's another interesting story. But I just wanted to show here that we took measurements of the pyramids and so forth, of course, together with our Egyptian colleagues. In the pyramid, we find 2 aisles on the left-hand side here, and another one. And this is an image taken from structure from motion, and what is called a de-stretched photo. The aisles are a little bit enigmatic. There is no burial chamber. Usually we understand pyramids as burial grounds. It means you would usually find in a pyramid the burial chamber of a king. But this small pyramid, as well as the other provincial pyramids, they didn't have burial chambers. So they were not burials, but they were rather monumental representations of kingship locally, but not burials. So we're still investigating. So we have to remove the blocks here that collapsed into the shafts and so forth. So this is still something that is ongoing, but I don't think that we will find a burial chamber here either. This is the pyramid from the top, and you can see here how it was built. It has several what is called accretion layers. So this inner part was built first, then a second layer was built against it, followed by a third layer, and finally the outer casing. Reconstructions, the classical reconstruction of the pyramid is like a stepped monument, comparable to the so-called step pyramid of Giza, which some of you may know. So you can recognize here the building technique. This is the inner core, the second accretion layer, the third accretion layer, and finally the outer casing. However, I should say this is one of the aisles that I've just shown. However, there is some debate over the reconstruction. So number one shows you the classical reconstruction based on the sketch that I've just shown you. Others believe that we should think of a monument that looks more like this, so that there was only one step. And this is because the so-called solar temples of the 5th dynasty, they had this shape. So one of my colleagues believes that we should think of these minor pyramids in provincial Egypt as resembling solar temples. And yet another scholar says, no, these were not pyramids at all. These were just these kinds of rectangular or square superstructures. The interesting argument about this reconstruction is that this type of building was known in provincial Egypt in the early Old Kingdom. This is what we call a mastaba. It's a certain type of tomb. So my colleague Barry Kemp, a very famous Egyptian archaeologist, Barry Kemp argues that the king ordered that a pyramid be built, but locally the people would translate this monumental piece of architecture into a form that was known locally. So rather than building a monument that is typically royal, they would simply build a monument that is comparable to what the local leaders would have as their tombs. So you can see here how in the reconstruction, and none of these reconstructions can be really proved with the evidence. It's a little bit of speculation, it's interpretation. And what's interesting about the interpretation is that the whole question of what is central, what is royal about the pyramid, and what is local plays into the reconstruction of this monument. That's why I find this discussion interesting. It's not just about speculating about the form, but it's the arguments that are used in order to justify a certain reconstruction. So number 3, here the argument would be is that this was basically a local piece of architecture, not a royal piece of architecture. So we started to look at the corners. This is the corner that is located towards the hill. And we can see here that the outer casing rests directly on the bedrock. There's a bit of concrete here. Perhaps some of this might be a little bit later, not yet sure about the date. But basically here, this corner rests directly on the bedrock. It is very different when you walk down the hill and you look at the front of the pyramid. Here you can see that the pyramid rests on 2 layers of a foundation, and below this is a sandy layer. Unfortunately, this photo is now dominated by this hole, and I have to say that it was very unfortunate. We made this trench in front of the pyramid. This was in the late afternoon, and then we went home in the evening, and when we came back the next day, suddenly a fox or one of the side dogs had dug this hole into our stratigraphy. Now it looks as if this hole was a very important feature, but actually it really came overnight. So you would have to remove this hole from this image in order to understand the stratigraphy. So what I find interesting about this the stratigraphy is that the pyramid was set against the bedrock, and then the area below it was leveled in order to create a platform on which the pyramid was built. Why is this significant? I mean, of course, you could say, of course, they had to level the ground. That's just normal. But it is significant because there has been much discussion about the orientation of the pyramid. This pyramid, different from the other provincial pyramids, is not located north-south. There is no north-south, east-west axis. North, south, east, west, these are important axes in the religion of ancient Egypt. For instance, the west is where the sun goes down and where the deceased were buried. The west is basically the realm of the deceased. And the north and the south are also important turning points for the sun that travels over the sky during the day and in the night. But this kind of religious explanation for the orientation of the pyramid didn't work. So we couldn't use these codified religious ideas to explain the orientation. Another idea is to align the pyramid with the course of the River Nile. And the River Nile also was a source of much religious interpretation because the Nile rose every day, and the inundation spilled fertile soil on the fields, and this was the basis for agriculture in Egypt and so forth. So the idea was that the ancient Nile ran parallel to the pyramid, and the pyramid mirrored the orientation of the River Nile. However, what I think is the case actually with our excavations is that the pyramid was built in order, it took up the local topography. It means that the line, the face towards the face towards the hill was built on the bedrock. So this line doesn't parallel the river; it parallels basically the bedrock without any religious implication. This was just a practical thing to do. And then the area on which the pyramid was built was leveled, and a foundation was laid out. So the point here is that we shouldn't use, that's my argument, we shouldn't use central religious explanations to explain this local building, but rather this local building respects the local topography. I think this is the story behind the orientation of this pyramid. So yeah, that's one of the results of preliminary results of our excavations. I can't present here the drawings simply because we didn't yet have, we are still at the beginning of our excavation. So not all the plans, or the plans are still in the process of being drawn. And I hope to publish them in the next year. Another colleague of mine had looked at the front of the pyramid, and he discovered this is the side which I've just shown you with the hole. The hole of the dog is located here approximately. And a colleague of mine did some surface clearance, I would say. It's not really excavations, just removing the sand a little bit. And he discovered that there was a pre-dynastic pod group buried in sandy gravel. So the pyramid of the early Old Kingdom is not the earliest structure at the site, but rather there was already a pre-dynastic cemetery. Pre-dynastic means this was approximately 500 years earlier. The pyramid was not built on a blank sheet of paper, if you want, but the landscape was already socialized. There were already people living at the site, as the cemetery demonstrates, and the site was already in use in one way or the other. So again, I find this interesting for the question how royal architecture was imposed on the local landscape. It was not just, it was not an uninhabited landscape, but people were already at the site, And what we try to find out is, what we try to investigate is how the settlement and how the cemeteries, where they were located, and how the pyramid changed the settlement structure. It's far too early for us to draw any definite conclusion. It's just that we have snippets of information here that it is possible to investigate the question. I would like to move now to the recently discovered cemetery here. And this is located to the south of the site. This is how the cemetery looks like. We haven't done much excavation due to Corona. We were not able to go back into the field since 2019. And so we couldn't resume our work. What you can see here is a series of shafts. Here is a shaft. Here is the beginning of another shaft, and much pottery lying on the surface. These are parts of beer pots other pieces. Excuse me, other pieces of other types of pots. I show you here drawings of the most important types of pottery that was found. This is a beer pot. This is the upper part of a beer pot. This is a bowl with an inner lip. And this is what is called in Egyptology a so-called Meidum bowl. It's just a specific type of bowl. And these bowls are very important for dating. This type of rim dates to the early Old Kingdom. It's exactly the time of Snefru. And what's exciting about this chronological disposition of the cemetery is that it is contemporaneous with the local pyramid. It means that with the help of the cemetery, suddenly we start to understand, or we suddenly start to see the people that lived in Zawit Sultan when the pyramid was built. They were buried here. So I hope that, of course, these shafts were robbed probably already in antiquity and several times, also in modern times. But still, very often, if you excavate carefully at the bottom of the shaft, at the burial chamber, you usually do find remains of the original burials, bones, for instance, coffins, and so forth and so forth. So we hope to approach the people, the builders of the pyramids, if you want. Another interesting feature of this cemetery is that not only these shaft tombs were found, but also other types of tombs. You can see here a group of rock boulders. And my colleague, Bart van Teunen, Dr. Bart van Teunen, who's working with me in Zawit Sultan, he discovered similar tombs elsewhere at a site a little bit further south of Zawit Sultan. And what these rock boulders actually are very simple tombs, rock circle tombs, as Dr. Fontaine calls them. So it's just a few loose stones draped around the burial. This individual, for instance, had a wooden coffin. This individual was just placed on a mat, or in a, no, this is a mat. These rock circle tombs are low status burials. So when we go back to this slide, so the argument, what is interesting, so we expect to find something similar here and here perhaps, and further down over here. So we have to look very carefully to find those tombs. So when I say that we try to approach the people of Zawit Sultan when the pyramid was built, we already get a sense of a hierarchy here. So these shaft tombs probably belong to the upper echelons of the community, whereas the lower echelons, the poorer parts of the community, were buried in these kinds of tombs. We can even expect that the poorest villagers were even not located here on the flat desert strip, but somewhere here further down in the cultivation. These tombs are lost today. So yeah, for what I find interesting is when we think of the pyramid, now we suddenly start to understand that there were local communities, and we can investigate these local communities, who they are, where they were located, where their cemetery was located, relative to the pyramid, relative perhaps also to the settlement, which we still need to find. And the final site for the final area of this site is the rock tombs, which are located here up in the desert escarpment. And this is one of the tombs that we are going to study in the future. It's one of the better preserved examples. This is how the cemetery looks like. You see here a whole range of tombs recorded around 1850, a little bit earlier, by a German Egyptologist called Richard Lepsius and his architect Gustav Erbkamp. And as you can see, all these tombs were within the rock. So this was the entry, and then you entered here a first chamber, a second chamber, and finally a third cult chamber. This is the tomb that we are focusing on. And there were a whole range of similar tombs here in Zavut Sultan. The tomb that I've just shown you belonged to an official called Khunes. And Khunes was an official of the early 6th dynasty, so 300 years later than King Snefru. In this, the pyramid, the tomb today looks very different from 150 years ago. You can see that the roofs have gone. It means that the entire rock tomb cemetery was used as a quarry. Dynamite has been used in order to bomb off the stone from the desert mountain, and many of the rock tombs have disappeared. But you can still see the structure that I've just shown you. This was the entrance hall, which is now lies open, and also the second chamber and the third cult chamber. Again, here is a model, a photographic model that shows the situation. All of these rock boulders have collapsed into the now open-lying first chamber, and rubble moved inside. These shafts here are part of the original tomb, and these smaller caves stem from the reuse of the tomb. And the reuse, this happened in the first century and the first millennium BC. What's interesting for my question about the colonization is that the central administration in the 6th dynasty used a new strategy. So what we've seen so far is we've seen nomes and domains and pyramids. And in the 6th dynasty, central administration actually sent officials of the court into the provinces in order to administer the provinces of Egypt. So it's a new strategy. I want to show you a bit of the tomb because it's quite exciting, I think. So the tomb was really beautifully decorated. You can see here very fine relief. This is part of a papyrus boat. You see here a series of men rowing. If you look very carefully, you can also see here a little hippo that comes out of the river Nile. And here is the foot of the tomb owner and the lower part of the leg. This is what you can see today. 150 years ago, this is how the wall looked like. The entire wall was still standing. The part that I've just shown you is this part over here. This is our little hippo here. This is the boat. These are the rowing men. And this is the foot that is still preserved. And all the rest of this decoration has been quarried away. So it's rather unfortunate. This is one of the decorated walls, and the decoration sheds light on the world of the governor. So the governor is shown here in his leisure time fowling, with a few fishermen here fishing. There is, here you see part of a harvest. Here is boat building for the tomb owner. So it's it's really a cosmos of how this official, Hunes, imagined his ideal world. And we can be rather sure that Hunes originally was somebody from the court, because the quality of the relief is so fine. This was not a local sculpture. We know this from other sites where rather crude decoration was executed, but the tomb of Hunes was really highest quality. So probably it was not only him being sent into the provinces, but also a royal sculptor who showed royal standards of monumental display locally. So there was a flux of royal culture into the provinces, into the late 6th dynasty. It's very different from the 4th dynasty, where this didn't happen. But in the 6th dynasty, suddenly, this court culture arrives in the provinces. A few impressions of the tomb. This is not all about the research question that I'm asking today, but it's just the results of our excavation. And I want to show this. So we started clearing the shafts, and this is quite heavy work also. So some of the blocks that had collapsed into the shafts are removed with this kind of construction, very typical in Egyptian excavation. And very experienced workmen. This is our foreman, and these are his people from Luxor that he brings with him, specialists. So they removed the blocks. And then we went down the shaft, and we found parts of a burial chamber full of rubble. But in the filling of the shaft and in the rubble of the chamber, we found a whole set of interesting, nice objects. This is a bronze figurine of the god Osiris, which has partially degraded, but it's still completely preserved. We also found these eyes, this eye. This is an inlay made again of bronze and limestone, and presumably the inner part of the eye here still had a finer, perhaps a dark inlay. So it's very nicely made. We also found the upper part of a feather. So this is the front side of the feather. You can see here still the structure of the feather. This is the reverse side, and here it broke. And also this is part of a, what's the English word for it? The horn of a ram. This is, so you can also hear the, again, made of bronze, and you can see here the structure of the horn. So what we see here is something like this. So in better preserved tombs from other sides, we know these kinds of statues which had feathers. So the feathers over here, they look like the ones I've just shown you. The upper part you can see here, the ram's horn, and some of the coffins had inlaid eyes. This is exactly the kind of equipment that we found in Zawid Sultan, but this does not stem from the Old Kingdom. So this is not of the first occupation, the original occupation of the tomb, but this material culture is typical, as you can see here, of the 23rd to 25th dynasties. It means around 600 BC or so much later when the tomb was reused. So we see that the biography of the monument is quite complex. It was not only used in the Old Kingdom, but it was later reused, presumably several times. We are still analyzing all the pottery that fall into the tombs. You can see here two of our ceramicists. And we found already that there was not only pottery of the Old Kingdom and pottery of the first millennium, but we also found pottery of the second millennium of the so-called New Kingdom. So it's very likely that these rock tombs of the governors of the late Old Kingdom were reused again and again through times. It's quite interesting to investigate this biography of the monument, which is so far is unknown in the research literature. There is some fun also on the excavation, true discovery, very enthusiastic team members who look into everything they find on the ground. It's a little bit dangerous, I have to say, but sometimes it's worth. So these two guys were very excited to see what might be in this little hole on the ground, and this is what they found. There's a completely unknown rock tomb, which we might, if we're lucky, we might excavate this later. You can see a series of rooms. It's possible perhaps to find the original shafts and the burials. So this is, if you want Indiana Jones archaeology, I think this is where you could do that if you want to. Most archaeology is not so exciting. Well, it is exciting, but documenting pottery and administering all your small finds and the soil samples is not quite the Indiana Jones archaeology, but this here really is about discovery of the finest. Yeah, and finally, the last site for our talk today is Elephantine. And here we find yet another strategy of central administration to connect to the local community. Not nomes, not domains, not pyramids, and not the officials sent into the provinces, but local temples. So Elephantine is, as I said, is an island located opposite Aswan in the River Nile. This is the situation on the map. Elephantine is this island here, and all of this is the modern town of Aswan. The southern tip of Elephantine Island is the archaeological zone. This is what you see here on the right-hand side. Today, this is just one island. In the Old Kingdom, these were two islands. The Nile flood was the level of the Nile was a little bit lower. So there was a western island and an eastern island. And on the eastern island, on western island, you also see a pyramid. So at Elephantine, I should say, a pyramid was also built. It's another example. We don't focus on the pyramid here on this side. We focus on the local temple. And the local temple was located here on the eastern island. The temple of the goddess Sated. That's the name of the goddess. This is how the site looks like today. There's a huge temple area over here of the Roman period and a few houses of the Byzantine period, mud brick houses. This is the stone temple. These are mud brick houses. These are a series of temples, but these are reconstructions. Why this is so, I will show you. When the German Archaeological Institute arrived at the site in 1969 and started working, they found this foundation of a temple. And it turned out that this was the foundation of a temple of the New Kingdom. A very interesting feature of this temple was this shaft. What the archaeologists did is they removed the foundation in order to understand how the earlier temple buildings located below the New Kingdom temple, how they looked like. So they started dismantling the foundation. And this is the shaft that I've just shown you. This was built from reused blocks of earlier temples. And the shaft led down to an area between three granite boulders. This, and another one over here. So this shaft connected to an earlier phase of the temple, namely to this phase. When the entire foundation was removed, this is what came to light. The shaft of the previous slide came down to this area here, and this is exactly where the earliest sanctuary of the goddess Sated was located. This temple is not the kind of monumental temple that you know, usually when you travel to Egypt and you go to Luxor, which some of you may have seen yesterday night on the on YouTube. There was a live stream of the reopening of the Sphinx Gallery, Ellie, or the Temple of Edfu. So you have these monumental temples. This is what the temples of Egypt look like usually, but the earliest temples of Egypt were not monuments. These were very small mud brick chapels, similar to what you can see here on the slide. The Temple of the New Kingdom was a monument placed over the earlier temple. The shaft of the New Kingdom still connected to the earliest phase. So there is something like an attempt is made to maintain connection to the most sacred part of ancient times. And this temple here doesn't, this temple of the Old Kingdom, shrine, we shouldn't say temple perhaps, but it's just a shrine, a local cult. This was part of my PhD research. This is why I'm quite enthusiastic about these early temples. They don't have much decoration. In fact, they don't have any decoration. There's no wall decoration. There is no inscription on the walls. All of this is something that we know from later temples. But instead, what we have is that these temples were packed with votive figurines, such as seated figurines of seated boys, and figurines of baboons, of crocodiles. Here, for instance, we also find pieces of jewelry and very simple pebbles that the commoners, the villagers of Elephantine in the 3rd millennium in the Old Kingdom, offered to their deity. These votive objects reflect the religious beliefs and the popularity of the local deity. With these votive objects, people would approach their deity, they would ask for certain things to happen, they would perhaps express their thanks for other things that they believed the goddess had done good to them. It's comparable perhaps to lighting a candle in a Catholic church today. This is what the votive objects speak about. So the story about these early temples is an almost absence of kingship. There is nothing about the king. So these are not, votive offerings of the king. There's no royal inscription or something. There's an absence of kingship, but a flourishing local religious practice centered on these shrines. I show you here some colored photos of a comparable temple, not Elephantine, it's a different one. This was part of my research. I tried to identify objects excavated at a site called Abydos and Hierakonpolis. I tried to relocate these objects that were excavated 100 years ago in museum collections today. Many of them, by the way, in the US, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and so forth. So you can imagine that in the grayish, brownish settlement architecture that the village of Elephantine was, these faience pieces were rather shiny. We usually think of faience as a rather cheap building material. It's not gold. It's not very hard to work on or so. You need some knowledge to produce it. But we usually think of it as rather cheap, but actually in the context of these local simple temples, they were probably quite visually impressive objects. If we look at the development of the temple of Elephantine through time, we see from the we can reconstruct a series of temple buildings. This is, if you concentrate on the right-hand side, this is the temple that I've just shown you, the temple of the Old Kingdom. The temple of the Middle Kingdom was reconstructed with the reused blocks that were found in the foundation of the New Kingdom. So this is where the reconstruction comes from. And in the Middle Kingdom, the temple already, the early temple was replaced by a much larger stone temple. And then in the New Kingdom, we can see another step in the monumentalization of the temple. That's this temple over here, so-called peripteral temple of Tutmosis III and Hatshepsut. On this slide, you can see the gradual monumentalization of the temple. And this is not only about the growing size and the more prestigious materials being used, from mud brick in the Old Kingdom to limestone and sandstone in the New Kingdom. But there's another story behind it, namely that these stone-lined temples were built by kings. From the Middle Kingdom onwards, kings penetrated into these local shrines. In fact, already slightly before the Middle Kingdom, but in the Middle Kingdom, this really reached a new scale. The kings suddenly understood, I say the kings, let's say the central bureaucrats, suddenly understood how important the local temples were for local communities. The local communities were interested in domains and in nomes and in pyramids. The local community clustered religiously around their local shrine. And when the kings arrived, they also started to decorate the temples. Here is an example of a king of the early Middle Kingdom, Mentuhotep II. He is depicted on a wall relief in the new temple. He's depicted between the local goddess Sated and the patron deity of his dynasty over here. His name is written over here, Mentu. So what happens here is a very interesting strategy. Mentuhotep is not depicted only with the patron deity of his dynasty. So he's not only thinking as a king, but he also depicts the local deity, Sated. So it's a combination of building local religious thought into royal display and royal ideology. The anthropologist Marriott studied a similar process in India in the 1950s, and he called this process in India, and I think it's entirely applicable to our situation here, he called it a twofold process of parochialization and universalization. Parochialization means that central ideas, royal ideas, were embedded locally, so they were explained locally. Universalization means that local religious ideas were built into royal ideology, into the ideas of central administration. And this strategy was the most successful of all. The temples in the long run, the local temples, they became the interfaces between local communities and central administration. We know from papyri of the New Kingdom, for instance, that the temples were the major nodes between central administration and local administrations. The temples had priests, and the priests were the local leaders in provincial Egypt. So the temples really, they became the institution that mediated between the kings and central administration on the one hand, and local communities on the other. Yeah, and this is basically my conclusion. How did the centralized state administration colonize the provincial hinterland? What I wanted to show is that when we talk about the ancient Egyptian state, we have to be aware that just to build pyramids and to represent the king and to declare that somebody is king of Egypt doesn't mean at all that kingship and the state work locally. For instance, domains were implemented, and they are very important for royal thinking about the provincial hinterland. But in the provincial hinterland, domains play a rather little role. So we don't see many documents relating to the domains in the provincial hinterland. The pyramids are the provincial pyramids are a very short-lived phenomenon. So they only date to the early Old Kingdom. In this period, the kings tried to implement kingship. They tried to represent kingship by building pyramids, which was a local piece of architecture, by building pyramids in local communities and demonstrate that kingship was present at the site. However, as far as we understand them, they were in use, or they were, we don't know exactly what happened actually around these pyramids, but the pottery evidence around the pyramids suggests that they were used for a very short time only. So it was a failed attempt by the crown to represent kingship. In the late Old Kingdom, first, the state sent officials into provincial Egypt so that these new governors would make the connection between the court, the royal court, and the provincial communities. But this destabilized the country, and these governors became rather independent. And this is what we see in the late Old Kingdom, when the country starts to disintegrate into several smaller polities. So if you want, the centralized state of the late Old Kingdom, they dug their own tomb by installing these central governors. The most successful strategy was by implementing kingship in the local temples. This is when the tentacles of central administrations clung around the temples. This is the moment in time when suddenly central concerns, royal ideology, and local concerns, the goddess Sated, for instance, religious practices in the temple of Elephantine, when central and local concerns coalesced. This is the moment in time when I believe the ancient Egyptian state started to function much more efficiently than it did in the early phases of the state. And with this, thank you for your attention. Here you can see our breakfast at the site with our Egyptian partners and with the mission members. I also have to thank a whole series of institutions, the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, which supports our work, my own university, University of Cologne, the University of Pisa. I should say that I have a cooperation partner, Professor Gianluca Mignacci from Pisa University, who is excavating the rock tombs. So the University of Pisa supports us, as well as the German Research Council. We have received larger grant to excavate the early Old Kingdom cemetery, with the rock circle tombs and the shaft tombs that I've shown you. The Gerda Henkel Stiftung supports financially a topographic survey of the site, and the Egypt Exploration Society provided pilot funding at an early time of our research at the site. So thank you to all these institutions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Let's hope that we don't have any problems now. That was a lot of stuff going on. Very interesting, quite something. I guess that we have already some questions. We were actually, let's stop the recording now.